Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another Jane Austen July video. And today I'm going to be pairing / matchmaking, if you will, the works of Jane Austen with the works of Emily Henry. So I've been planning to make this video more or less since last Jane Austen July, because Emily Henry is a modern contemporary romance writer who I really like, and whose books I think will appeal to you if you like Jane Austen. And a few months ago, Emily Henry published her 6th adult romance novel. She does have some YA as well, but in terms of her fiction for adults, she has 6 romance novels out at present. Hopefully there will be more. But as we have 6 main novels from Jane Austen, I thought it might be quite fun to pair up Emily Henry's novels with Jane Austen's novels and recommend to you the Emily Henry novel you will like if you like a particular Jane Austen novel, and vice versa. In general, I do think Emily Henry is an author you will like if you like Jane Austen, and vice versa. Emily Henry is clearly fairly inspired by Jane Austen. There's quite a few Jane Austen references in multiple books by her, and I think that they have quite a lot in common. Both of them are writers who have a central love story that drives the plot, but also deal with a lot of other things. I would say that some of Jane Austen's novels are much more about the love story than others, whereas all of Emily Henry's books are love stories, but there are lots of other elements going on, lots of other themes. And I think I've said before that one of the reasons why I love Emily Henry so much as an author is that for me, she writes romance books with the perfect balance of the love story and the life story, and there's so much else going on beyond the love story, especially often in relation to family, in relation to grief, in relation to friendship. There's a lot of character growth, and her books are also very funny. And all of these things are things that I think will appeal to you if you like Jane Austen. And also vice versa, if you like Emily Henry, if you like her wit and her themes and her characterization, I think you will enjoy Jane Austen too. In this video, I'm going to be, as I said, matchmaking Emily Henry novels with Jane Austen novels. I have paired up each of Jane Austen's novels with each of Emily Henry's novels. Some of the pairs make much more sense than others, and I'm going to start off with the ones that are really solid pairings, and then we will go further down the list into ones where I have slightly fudged things, but you know, that's fine. Anyway, let me start off with the pairing that initially inspired this video idea, and that is Sensibility by Jane Austen and Book Lovers by Emily Henry. I will say that I don't have physical copies of any of Emily Henry's books. I've listened to them all on audiobook, and they work really well on audiobook for me, as indeed does Jane Austen. It is a shame I don't have any nice pretty paperbacks to hold up for you, but anyway. So Sensibility and Book Lovers have quite a lot in common, but the reason why I think of these books together and why I think you'll like one if you like the other is because at their heart is the story of 2 very different sisters, and the relationship between them, and the love between them, but also the lack of understanding between them. So Sensibility is about Eleanor and Marianne, and the book is in part about their romantic relationships, the men they meet, and how different these 2 sisters are, and therefore how unable they are to understand each other's approach to romantic relationships. Eleanor is very reserved and, you know, keeps her emotions bottled up, whereas Marianne is very emotional, likes to wallow in her emotions, and wears her heart on her sleeve. And in Book Lovers, we have a kind of similar dynamic of 2 sisters who are very different, want quite different things from life, and sort of struggle to understand each other. So we have Nora and her sister Libby. Nora is a literary agent, and she is very high-powered, very organized and methodical, and you know, keeps her emotions very bottled up, and doesn't ever let herself have any moment of weakness because she thinks that she can't. And her sister is very different to her, and she thinks that she has to look after her sister. And the book kind of begins with them going on holiday together, a holiday that Nora doesn't really want to take, but takes because she feels like it's a good thing to do for her sister. And while they're on this holiday, Nora also meets a professional rival of hers called Charlie, and that's the kind of beginning of a sort of enemies to lovers love story, although I feel like I've heard this described as enemies to lovers quite often, and then really not enemies for very long. It is more enemies to friends to lovers love story, I suppose. I just think that if you like the sister dynamic in Sense and Sensibility or in Book Lovers, you will like the other book. And I think the relationship between the two sisters and that like lack of understanding in both books really reminds me of each other. And there are, you know, direct Sense and Sensibility references in Book Lovers. Like Emily Henry was obviously a bit inspired by Sense and Sensibility there. And I just think that, yeah, if you like one, you will like the other. My next pairing is Persuasion and Happy Place. So Persuasion is the story of Anne Elliot, who several years before rejected a man who she was in love with because she was persuaded by her family that it wouldn't be a good match. But now this man, Captain Wentworth, has made more of himself, would now be considered much more eligible, and comes back into her life. But there is obviously a lot of complicated feelings between them because of what happened in the past. Happy Place, meanwhile, is the story of Harriet and Wynne and their friends. Harriet and Wynne were a couple for a long time, but broke up a few months ago. But because they are in a very tight-knit group of friends, and they are both aware that their breakup would more or less destroy that group of friends, they haven't told anyone yet. And they're going away for the summer as a group. Wynne is not meant to be coming, but when Harriet arrives, she finds that her ex-fiancé is present, and there is, of course, a lot of tension and secret-keeping that follows. And there are two reasons why I have paired Persuasion and Happy Place. One of them is the sort of second chance love story going on in both of these novels, but the other reason is that both of these novels kind of look at feeling like an outsider within your own family. So Anne Elliot doesn't get on that well with her sisters or her father. She has always kind of felt like an outsider, and her father and one of her sisters especially treat her quite badly. They don't really like her or know her or understand her. And we see a kind of similar thing with Harriet in Happy Place. She doesn't really get on with her own family very well at all. And in fact, she has always felt much more home in Wynne's family, which kind of makes the breakup like even tougher on her. And I feel like the way that book looks at family, and the way both these books look at family and sort of complicated relationships within families, is just really, really interesting, and, you know, has a few similarities between Persuasion and Happy Place. I really do love the way Emily Henry writes about family. She writes a lot about family and about people's relationship with their siblings and their parents, in a way that I just really, really like. It's an element I always love in her books. And obviously family and relationships between parents and children and siblings is something Jane Austen is obviously very interested in too. So I think that's an element of Emily Henry's books you will like if you like Jane Austen. Then my third pairing is Mansfield Park and You and Me on Vacation, also called People We Meet on Vacation. And I have paired these two books for two reasons. Partly because they are the stories of friends falling in love, and because they deal with kind of unrequited, complicated feelings in certain circumstances, but also because they are like books that I absolutely love and no one else seems to love as much as me. I mean, that's exaggerating, but Mansfield Park isn't very many people's favourite Jane Austen book. It's my second favourite Jane Austen book. I love it so much, and a lot of people don't like it. And You and Me on Vacation seems to be one of Emily Henry's like least loved books. I hear a lot of people not liking You and Me on Vacation, whereas personally I think it is my favourite Emily Henry book and I absolutely loved it. So therefore it has a similar like position as Mansfield Park in that sense, as well as having some similar elements in terms of the sort of like friends to lovers trope, as we would call it today. Mansfield Park is a story of Fanny Price, who is sent away from her parents at a young age to go and live with wealthy relations in a place called Mansfield Park. She always feels out of place there. She's treated as lesser by a lot of her family, but not by her cousin Edmund, whom she develops a long-standing kind of unrequited attachment for. And yes, this book is about Fanny Price being in love with her cousin, but you know, it was the Regency period. That was perfectly acceptable at that point in time. And it is worth saying that like you will very often find cousins falling in love in 19th century literature, and partly that is because there wasn't like a proper model for men and women being friends, unless they were in some way related. So if you want a story of two friends falling in love in a 19th century book, they're probably going to be related in some way or another. Sometimes they'll be related like through the marriage of other relatives, as in Emma, and then that feels a lot more comfortable, but sometimes they are cousins, and you know, that's just a fact when you're reading 19th century books. Anyway, Mansell Park is a wonderful, wonderful novel. The love story is important, but it's not really the heart of the book. There is so much social criticism in this book. There is so much about family and home, and finding a home and finding a place you belong. And there's so much about kind of being true to yourself and knowing what you want. And I love Fanny Price as a character. She is quite like meek and quiet, but she also has a real like strength of spirit, and I love that about her very much. Anyway, my little rant about why I love Mansell Park is over. You and Me on Vacation, meanwhile, is a wonderful story of Alex and Poppy, who have been friends for I think about a decade, since they were at university together, and every year they go on a trip together, except something happened on one of those trips 2 years ago and they've barely spoken since. But this summer, Poppy invites Alex to come with her on another trip, and we follow what happens on that trip, as well as looking back on all their previous trips. And we follow their friendship, and how their friendship has potentially come to shift to something else. I think there's a moment where Poppy describes their friendship as like 95% friends, 5% what if, and you see slowly over time how that what if grows. I love You and Me on Vacation so much. It is, as I said, I think my favourite Emily Henry book. It is the first one I read, which I do think sometimes makes a difference. You know, I think the first book you read by an author you love often has like a special place in your heart, but I do also just think it's a wonderful story, and I love everything else surrounding the love story, and I love the way it looks at these two people growing up who care so deeply about each other but are very different, and how they navigate that, and I just think it is wonderful. So there we go. If you like Mansell Park, I would recommend You and Me on Vacation, and vice versa. And in general, I would just really recommend both You and Me on Vacation and Mansell Park, both of which I think are quite underrated works by much loved authors. Okay, my next pairing is Northanger Abbey and Great Big Beautiful Life. Northanger Abbey is the story of a young woman called Catherine Morland, who goes away from home for the first time, makes some friends, ends up staying at a mysterious place called Northanger Abbey, where her overactive imagination and love of Gothic novels starts to influence what she sees there. Great Big Beautiful Life, meanwhile, is a story of two non-fiction writers competing to write the biography of a famous celebrity, while she tells them both things about her life and may or may not be telling them the truth. It is a sort of Emily Henry meets Taylor Jenkins Reid kind of novel, I suppose, with shades of The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and a really great kind of story within a story element. I have only just finished reading Great Big Beautiful Life, so I will talk about that more in my June wrap-up, but I really, really loved it. And the reason why I put these two books together is because they are quite meta in some ways. Like, they talk about fiction and truth and stories, and look at characters learning to make sense of what they're seeing and to understand what they're seeing. And they also look at characters who are maybe sometimes looking at things the wrong way, I suppose. So Northanger Abbey is a parody of Gothic fiction, but it's quite like a loving parody, I suppose. And there's a lot in it about the importance of novels and fiction. And yes, maybe sometimes reading too many novels can make you look at things the wrong way, but also novels are great things that bring joy. And meanwhile, Great Big Beautiful Life is kind of an ode to the love story, whether that is a real life love story or a fictional love story. And I really love the way it looks at stories and truth, and I think that is a theme that you see in Northanger Abbey as well. So I would recommend those two books as ones that pair well together. I do feel that my first three pairings were the best pairings, and now the pairings are slightly more arbitrary, but you know, bear with me, I still think they are decent. And again, I do in general just think that if you like Jane Austen, you'll like Emily Henry, and vice versa. My penultimate pair is Pride and Prejudice and Beachread, partly because these two books are sort of enemies to lovers stories in some way, where there are bad first impressions that must be resolved later, and where one person falls first, I suppose. But also these two books are sort of the universal favourites in some ways, I suppose. I feel like Pride and Prejudice is an awful lot of people's favourite Jane Austen book, certainly my favourite Jane Austen book, and I feel like Beachread is an awful lot of people's favourite Emily Henry book. It's not actually my favourite Emily Henry book. I would probably say that Beachread is my least favourite, but for a slightly random reason that I feel like would affect other people less. But basically, random side note here, but Beachread is Emily Henry's first adult novel, and it's written in past tense. And all the rest of her books since have been written mostly in present tense. I think Happy Place and You and Me in Vacation, which have some flashback chapters. I can't remember if the flashback chapters are in past tense. They might be. I feel like they probably are. But the main central narrative is all in present tense. But Beachread is in past tense. And I just feel like Emily Henry's writing style suits present tense so much better. Her writing style just really suits the immediacy of present tense. And so I feel like Beachread, because it was written in past tense, I just felt like a tiny bit removed from it in a way I just haven't with the rest of her books. And I do think that was her first adult romance. And I think she probably just hadn't yet discovered how amazing present tense was and how well suited her voice and her writing style was to it. You know, the fact that all her books since have been written in present tense, you know, probably tells you that that's the tense she actually likes writing most now. But I do feel like Beachread, therefore, I love slightly less because she hadn't found the perfect way to tell her stories yet. But anyway, that's a side note. It's a great story. I still loved it. It's really fun. And also quite dark and serious in places too. So anyway, Pride and Prejudice, if you don't know, is the story of Elizabeth Bennet and her sister Jane and the rest of their family. Their father's property is entailed away, so they know that someone in the family is going to have to marry well in order to provide for the rest of them. And at the beginning of the book, Elizabeth and Jane meet two young men who have recently arrived in the town. Jane immediately really likes Mr. Bingley, and Elizabeth immediately hates Mr. Darcy. But he does not exactly immediately hate her. Something more complicated soon emerges from his side, and everything goes on from there. It is a wonderful, wonderful story. You know, I think a lot of people talk about the trope of sort of enemies to lovers and talk about Pride and Prejudice as sort of an original beginning version of that trope. I do think a lot of these sort of tropes do go back much earlier. I reckon there's lots of moments you can see origins of these tropes in Shakespeare and stuff as well. But anyway, if you like that trope, you will like Pride and Prejudice, and you will also, I think, like Beachread, which is about two rival writers, again, who make a bet one summer to try and cure their writer's block. So we have a writer who usually writes romance and a writer who usually writes literary fiction, and they decide to swap genres, and he will try to write a romance novel, she will try to write a literary fiction book. They try and teach each other how to write in each other's genres, but there is a sort of initial bad impression between them, and a sort of initial dislike between them to a certain extent, and the rivalry element is really interesting. As I said, Beachread would not be my favourite Emily Henry book, but I do really love it, and I do think there is a reason why it is the favourite of a lot of other people, which is partly because of that sort of writing and book element, and partly because of the more sort of serious themes that go through it. As I said, Emily Henry is an author who looks quite a lot at family and grief, and that's definitely a key part within Beachread, and yeah, I just think that these two books are books that you might enjoy together. And then finally, my last pairing for this video is Emma and Funny Story. And actually the reason I've paired these two books together is kind of nothing to do with the love story. It's actually much more about the sort of small town feel and the small town story. Emma is the story of Emma Woodhouse, who lives nearby the large village / small town of Highbury, and she likes to matchmake other people, but is determined that she will never marry anyone herself. But, you know, maybe she might change her mind. Who knows what could happen in a Jane Austen novel. And one thing that I love about Emma, one of my absolute favourite things about it as a book, is the sort of way this book looks at small town life, and the interactions of this small place. Emma has basically never left this small town, and the way this book looks at the kind of setting and the community here and the gossip within it, and the interactions between different people is something I just really, really love. And that's something I also really loved in Funny Story. So Funny Story is about a woman whose fiance has just split up with her very out of the blue, in order to go off with his childhood best friend, and she is now left sort of on her own, really isolated in the small town that she moved to for him. She can't leave yet because there's something at work that she has committed to doing. So she has a few months left in this place that she never really wanted to move to, where she knows no one except for her former fiance. And she's ended up living with her former fiance's now new girlfriend's ex-boyfriend because he needs someone to split the rent with him. And of course, you know, maybe they end up falling in love. Who can say what would happen in an Emily Henry book? But one thing that I loved in Funny Story is that this is a love story, yes, but it's also a wonderful character development story, a wonderful friendship story, and a wonderful, like, place story, because a lot of the book is about our main character kind of falling in love with this town that she has lived in without knowing. And I really enjoy the sort of small town story and the way she comes to really appreciate this place and the people within it. And that's something that I think if you enjoy the kind of small town setting in Emma, you will really enjoy in Funny Story, and vice versa. There was also one other reason why I sort of thought to pair Emma and Funny Story together, but it's a spoiler for something in Emma, so I'm not going to tell you. But, you know, maybe if you've read both, you will kind of see what I mean, but maybe you won't. Anyway, it's fine. So there we go. That's my matchmaking complete. I'm sure Emma would approve. If you like any of these Jane Austen novels or any of these Emily Henry novels, I think you might like the ones I have paired them with. In general, as I said, I do think these are two authors that you will probably like one if you like the other. But I thought this might be a fun little video to do, just, yeah, pairing up Emily Henry books and Jane Austen books. They're two authors who I love a lot. So there we go. That's all for now. Do let me know down in the comments if you have read any of these books, what you thought of them, if you would make different pairings at all, and if there's any other authors you think people would like who like Jane Austen. That would be lovely to know. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.